Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is once again in your future. And this segment, an old friend of this show, Thomas Fleming, a prolific author, in particular of American history. We have had him on several times in the past. Most recently, he was on talking about a disease in the public mind. He has written more than 40 works about American history, in particular, a brand new one, fascinating one, called The Great Divide, the conflict between Washington and Jefferson that defined a nation. And with that title, an interesting subject indeed. Mr. Fleming, how are you, my friend?
I'm very good. I hope you're well, Warner.
I think we're very, very good here. The whole idea of the Founding Fathers is a subject that I know that is of tremendous interest to you. You've made a career out of it. I'm just curious, before we start talking about the Great Divide between these people, why the American Revolution is so important to you as subject matter.
Because I grew up in a totally Irish-American city called Jersey City, right across the river from New York. And I never thought of myself as an American. I thought of myself as an Irish-American until I started reading about the American Revolution. And then I found my American roots, and that's why it's meant so much to me.
You know, when you talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, just the tops of the trees glimpse would be these are two people very much aligned philosophically, historically, all sort of fighting for the same thing. But the fact of the matter was that underneath, they were very, very different people, weren't they?
They really were. The difference between their personalities is astonishing, and but it makes for great history. That's the way I look at it. I'm not being critical of either one, but I think I freely admit, however, I do think Washington had the better answer to the long-range happiness and prosperity of the country. But Jefferson is an enormously gifted man. There's no doubt about that, and the fact that those words of the Declaration of Independence still vibrate in everybody's soul if they're an American. That alone entitles him to a place in history.
Do you think, again, Washington came, while he was highly accomplished, came from a much more humble beginnings and hard-working beginnings, so to speak, versus Jefferson's? Would you agree with that? And how did that maybe influence him?
Jefferson was the wealthy oldest son who inherited the best land and all that sort of thing, and Washington was the second of was the son of his father's second wife, and there were two older brothers who certainly looked in the beginning like they were definitely the favorites and the ones who would have most of the power and influence and so forth. But fate decreed that they died, and Washington inherited Mount Vernon, but even in his teens, of course, these older men hadn't died yet. He was ready to work. He worked as a surveyor, and he did a really good job. Everything that Washington tackled, he found out how it worked, how things should go, and then he made it go that way. But he also had this great instinct, or great talent, rather, for fame, particularly military fame. And he got interested. He wanted to be a soldier from a very early age, and he was imitating his older brother, who had been he had a job in the Virginia military establishment, and Washington inherited that when he died, and he just distinguished himself again and again as a soldier. This was before the Revolution. He became Virginia's most famous soldier. He commanded a regiment out on the frontier during the French and Indian War, and it was really tough stuff, you know. He had to hang men for desertion. He had to rally guys who weren't the best soldiers in the world, to put it mildly, and all this time he was acquiring a military knowledge. There's a great myth about Washington. I recently wrote an article for Politico called 5 Myths About George Washington, and one of them was one of the biggest was that he didn't read. He wasn't a reader. And it just isn't so. Every time he ever was in a new job, Washington read about it. He found out who the experts were, and he did it right. And but the big thing in this book, Warner, is the style of life he led. This came to. I knew I had a good book when this sentence came to me. Washington was a man who lived dangerously. Danger, for an awful lot of people, danger is a very alarming experience. They don't want to have it around, But Washington could deal with it because he knew what he was doing almost all the time. And that is one of the key ideas that distinguishes him from Jefferson. Jefferson did not enjoy or want to live dangerously. During the American Revolution, he was governor of Virginia for 2 years, from 79 to 81, and he was a disaster. It's true the revolution was falling apart, too. We were bankrupt, and nobody knew the answer to whether we were going to win or lose. But Jefferson just didn't have the ability to gather together whatever resources there were in Virginia, which was incidentally the biggest state in the Union. He just didn't know how to lead people in an immediate way, as the head of an army. He was great at writing papers about the war and inspiring people with, as I've already described, the Declaration of Independence. And I think here we might pause, Warner, and realize what a huge accomplishment the Declaration of Independence was. After the American Revolution and our independence, over the next 200 years, over the next 100 years, there were 200 other declarations of independence all around the world, imitating our declaration. It just showed what an incredible ability he had to reach into the hearts and minds of men with magical words.
Do you? We've had other historians on that have said and suggested that George Washington, once elected to the presidency, really helped define it and strayed away from maybe the original intent of the office. Do you agree with that? Made it a little bit more imperial and a little bit more powerful than what it was originally thought to be?
No, I don't agree with that because, as you'll see in the Great Divide, I maintain that from the very beginning, the whole thing about the presidency and the Constitution really got started when Washington was visited by James Madison. He started coming to Mount Vernon to talk about the kind of federal government they needed. This was in 1785, and Washington had ideas already that he was able to give Madison, general big ideas, and one of them was the presidency. He saw in 8 years of fighting a revolutionary war. Imagine an 8-year war. He had to deal with this Continental Congress, and they had no president. They had a guy who had the title of president, but he had no power whatsoever. Here's how powerless the president of the Continental Congress was. If you sent a letter to the president of the Continental Congress, he didn't even have the power to read it, to open it. He had to give it to to a committee, and they read it and told him what was in it. But he had no power. Congress as a body was the power, and Washington saw that this was an invitation to disaster. 50 or 60 guys, all with different opinions, trying to decide the policy of a war for survival. It just didn't work, and more Washington saw that the key to a successful country was leadership. There had to be one man or a very small group of men who provided the image and the words and the ideas and the example to bring the rest of the country behind him. And this is why he said we got to have a strong president. And he pushed Madison in this direction, and Madison became more and more enthusiastic too. And here we get to the key difference, or one of the, it is the greatest difference between Jefferson and Madison. And the history has something to say about why this difference arose so strongly. Jefferson wasn't around. In 1784, he went to France and became the ambassador over there, and he stayed there until 1789 or 90, and so he was out of the whole creation of the Constitution, and he somehow, I think, resented this. He didn't like to be left out of anything, and he was a very talented and intelligent man, and so he was very critical of the Constitution when he read it. He said, he told John Adams, who was ambassador to London at the time, he said, I just can't get over all the things they have in it. I was inclined to support it because of the distinguished men who were creating it. He said, but I'm shocked. I thought all we were going to do was add 3 or 4 different clauses, new clauses to the good old Articles of Confederation. That was what they called the original Constitution that backed up the Continental Congress. And then Jefferson said the fateful words that really have created my book. He said, and as for the presidency, it's a bad imitation of a Polish king. Now, the Polish king was elected by the people, which among the aristocrats of Europe at the time was practically an invitation to inferiority. But the other thing was he served for life, like all kings. And Jefferson was saying that this office was much too powerful, and the man who became president was never going to let go of it. He was going to turn himself into a dictator or a king. Like so many things that Jefferson predicted about the future politically, he was dead wrong. And there is another big difference between Washington and Jefferson. They didn't have this instinct for understanding what worked and what could lead the country into the future. Washington, he had a great motto that I think is probably the key to his success. He said, we must take men as they are, not as we wish them to be. Now, there is a motto that goes straight to the heart of realism. Jefferson thought of everybody as a sort of mirror image of himself, and he didn't need a lot of power and so forth. His intentions were good, and he thought that all these farmers in America would imitate his example, and so forth and so forth. He saw a nation of farmers. Washington had his eye on England and the power that they achieved because they had become the world's first great commercial nation. And Washington was convinced that America could do the same thing. He was, I might add, a very good businessman and made money running Mount Vernon, whereas Jefferson just piled up debts until, in the end, after he died, they sold Mount Vernon and all the slaves just to pay off the debt, and even that didn't come close to what he really owed.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Our special guest, Thomas Fleming, noted historian and author of more than 40 books, primarily on the American Revolution and that era and the men and the events that captured that period. Thomas, here's a question for you, a big sort of philosophical one. Does the American Revolution happen without Washington or without Jefferson?
Yes, it would, but I think it would have wandered into sectionalism and irrelevance. These guys from New England, John Adams in particular, were very intelligent, and they knew that the New Englanders, they were all descendants of the Puritans, and they were all a bunch of righteous guys. You know, they thought they had the answer to everything, and they were more virtuous than the rest of the country. As a result, the rest of the country hated their guts. They really did. They didn't like them, but Adams saw this when he got down and became one of the delegates to the Continental Congress, and he saw that they had to get the rest of the country involved in this whole uprising against the arrogance of the British and their determination to tax Americans until they were bankrupt. And so he's the one who said, I nominate George Washington to be the commander of this new army. And he also, when he was part of the committee that Congress named to write the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson, being sort of a modest man, at least in public, you know, I mean, he wasn't arrogant to come on. He didn't come on like a know-it-all, and he said, who's going to write it? And Adams said, you are. See, again, they were bringing another Virginian into the game right at the top of the heap. And that's the key to why the American Revolution succeeded, because Virginia, the biggest state, had contributed the two greatest men in the creation of, even in the embryo, the creation of the country under the Articles of Confederation. And I think that's what we have to give John Adams in particular credit for a lot of smart politics.
Well, Martha Washington got into the game too. In the book, one of the interesting lines that I thought was fascinating was Martha Washington remembering the two worst days of her life. One was when her husband George died, and the other was the day that Thomas Jefferson came to see her to offer his condolences. Tell us about that.
I'm glad you liked that one. I found that one, and I said, again, that was like, I know this is going to be a good book. When you find something that great, you know, you think, oh my God, everybody's going to really flip when they see this, and just as I did, you know. Yeah, well, Martha was. There's a wonderful anecdote about Washington and Martha. When Washington left the presidency, he retired to Mount Vernon, you know, and he had a sort of flirtation with a very pretty woman in Philadelphia, and she used to write him sort of flirtatious, again, for want of a better word, letters. And so she wrote a very funny letter to Washington, saying that when they took over the house where he'd been living, they found in a secretary, that's a piece of furniture I'm talking about, they found in the drawer of a secretary a packet of letters, and many of them were from, quote, a lady. She was kidding, you know. And Washington wrote back and he said, I'm afraid if you tell your friends this in those terms, they'll think, oh, this is a great scandal that is about to explode. He said, but they won't find enough warmth in those letters to even light a small fire. These letters are not about amorous love. They all are based on friendship. And this, in the 18th century, and I think there's something to be said even for our own time. In the 18th century, the greatest compliment a man could pay his wife was to call her his friend, because that meant he felt free to talk to her in the most intimate way about all his thoughts and feelings, about life in general, about politics, etc. And this was the great compliment that Jefferson paid Martha. He really did respect her intelligence and her judgment, and so he shared all his thoughts and feelings about Thomas Jefferson with her. So that's where the remark about the Second War, because she realized that Washington had lost all faith in Jefferson by the time he died. In fact, here's how bad it was, Warner. Jefferson, when Washington died in late 1799, very unexpectedly, he was in good health, and then he got an infection in his throat that interfered with his breathing, and he died very painfully over the course of 8 or 9 or 10 hours. But by this time, Jefferson and Washington had become enemies. And even though Jefferson had been elected vice president under John Adams, he had run against Adams for president, and in those days we didn't have a ticket yet. They created that in a few years after Jefferson became president, a two-man ticket to run for the two highest offices. But Jefferson was the vice president, and the president, that meant he was president of the Senate. He should have been there to preside over Washington's memorial service and everything. He refused to come. He couldn't bring himself to go and be such a faker as to mourn George Washington. It's a kind of sad but very graphic glimpse of how bad the feelings were between the two of them by the time Washington died.
Yeah, that's. What about this whole idea? These are two very, very powerful men, strong personalities, each with their own incredible strengths, each with weaknesses. While they may not have agreed, and you call it the Great Divide, wasn't there some value to this sort of yin-yang relationship and what they brought to the table, that they did bring different talents, and some of that conflict might have been good for the country overall? Is that possible?
Well, I think it was good for the country in several ways. Well, for one, Jefferson formed a political party called the Republicans, which these days historians call them the Democratic Republicans, because they are the predecessors of today's Democratic Party. So he formed this political party against Washington's party, who were called the Federalists at that time, but Washington knew what was going on. There's a wonderful anecdote I came across too that shows what a shrewd guy Washington was. Jefferson did some pretty wild things. He founded a newspaper that attacked Washington's administration every day. And his bête noire was Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, because Hamilton came up with a lot of the ideas to make this commercial nation that Washington envisioned work. You know, he created a Bank of the United States, which helped pay off the debt from the American Revolution, all this. So Jefferson's paper was attacking Washington every day. But here's how bad it was. Jefferson, the editor of Jefferson's paper, worked for the State Department. He was getting a salary from the State Department, and yet here he was out there tearing Hamilton, and then pretty soon he was attacking Washington too, day in and day out. And in Washington's papers, I found 2 anonymous letters that some guy sent to Washington without signing them, and they told Washington everything that Jefferson was doing. And they said his goal is to succeed you as president and make this a different country, da-da-da-da-da, and so forth and so forth. The fact that Washington didn't throw these letters away, even though they were unsigned, is a very significant thing. He left them in his papers because he thought they're telling the truth, and he wanted later generations to see that as the truth. So you see what you're up against here. 2 very smart guys, but 2 very daring guys, too. Now, Washington, even though he knew what Jefferson was up to, he kept Jefferson on as Secretary of State. He wanted him in the cabinet. Why? For cover. Cover, C-O-V-E-R. As long as Jefferson was a member of his administration, he couldn't go too far. The newspaper could of course go very far and say wild things. Here's how bad that paper was, incidentally. When the French Revolution really went wild, when they started guillotining and everybody, and this paper was still attacking Washington over in America. One day they ran a cartoon of George Washington strapped to a board being carried toward a waiting guillotine. Now, it shows how far Jefferson's editor was willing to go. But Jefferson could pretend that he had nothing to do with all this. Oh, my goodness, so forth. But he wasn't fooling Washington for 1 minute. And Washington, as we've already seen, was telling Martha his private opinions, and he was telling a lot of other people too. And things got worse and worse Jefferson really couldn't stomach the idea of this Bank of the United States selling shares and so forth. And here's how he hated the idea of a stock market, Jefferson did. And he wrote a letter to James Madison, who by this time had become Jefferson's right-hand man. It shows the power of Jefferson's powers of persuasion. He took Madison away from Washington, and Madison became his guy. And he wrote a letter to Madison saying that he understood that a lot of merchants in Richmond, Virginia, were rushing to Philadelphia to buy shares in the Bank of the United States and get their share of what Jefferson called federal filth.
Well, the subject matter we could talk about endlessly. A fascinating study of the relationship between Washington and Jefferson. The work is called The Great Divide, the conflict between Washington and Jefferson that defined a nation, by prolific historian and author Thomas Fleming. It is a truly, truly interesting work of history and a look back at these two incredible American figures. Thomas, how can our listeners get a copy of the book and find out more about your work?
They can get it on Amazon, and it was just issued by Audible. And so it's available on audible.com, and that means you can listen to it if you don't feel like reading it all. And so it's on Amazon, and I think I would like to recommend people read my website, because they'll read a good summary of the book there on the website. Incidentally, the first 5 reviews we got on Amazon are all total raves. They just they all got 5 stars or 4 stars. But anyway, my website is thomasflemingwriter.com. All one word, you know.
thomasflemingwriter.com. Got it. Okay.
Okay.
Well, I really appreciate you being on here again. You've been on here many times.
You ask such great questions. You get to the heart of the book. You really do.
Well, what about let's do this again? You've just put your pen down on this one. What future plans do you have, or you got those defined yet?
I do. I have another book that I've done a proposal for. It's called Encounters with History, and the subtitle is Inside Stories from the American Century. And it's all about the incredible number of pretty important men that I met, starting with President Harry Truman. I spent 2 weeks with him one year in 1970, writing a biography of him with his daughter. And General Leslie Groves, the guy who built the atomic bomb. I spent a lot of time with him when I wrote a history of West Point. So I think it's a book that people will really be fascinated by. Oh, and one more quickie, Warner, that I think your readers might be interested in. I was in the first integrated company in the history of the U.S. Navy when I was in boot camp.
Wow.
I had black sailors sleeping on my left and right and in the bunk above me. And the great thing is we got along perfectly. It was the beginning of what I think is one of the greatest and least known achievements in America, the fact that our military services are totally integrated, and prejudice, race prejudice, has been banished. It just is gone, you know. And it's a really great achievement, and that's going to be in that book, because my interest in this started when I was actually doing the very thing, learning to get along with black sailors.
Well, again, we appreciate your time. We'll look forward to that new work, and would love to have you back on again.
Well, I'll be looking forward to it too, Warner. Thank you very much.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.